So this is going to involve some multitasking. You will have to chew and listen at the same time. And in the course of your conversations, which are inevitable and in fact desirable, I ask you to please also accord attention to this remarkable crew of people. So my name is Marty Perlmutter. I'm an old friend of Victor Harwood's, and that's why I'm here. I work in interactive media and education. And I used to smoke pot all the time until they made it legal, and I was out. But I might sneak back in for the business. So this morning, we had two remarkable panels in this room. There, as you all know probably, there is no way to handle the money. You can't do bank clearance. So there are businesses today that have literally millions of dollars. There are tractor trailer loads of $100 bills floating around the state of California. It probably is the safest place to put them, is on a tractor and just run them around. There's no banking system. So Senator Hertzberg, who represents my area, the Valley, was here this morning to talk about a bill that he's hoping to pass next year to begin a specific bank to handle in the state of California the tens of billions of dollars that are going to be generated in the business part of this thing. We also heard about legal and regulatory matters, which are a blank tabula rasa right now. The Kat Packer was here first thing this morning, and she's the person who's going to make the rules or promulgate the rules. But the city of LA and the county of LA is begging for assistance in figuring out a framework for the very rules that will allow people to consume pot, because as many of you may know, unless you happen to own a house, there's no place where you can legally consume it in LA. It is that profound a vacuum. So, regulation, banking, money, business, all these things we've heard about, but maybe most important of all, and for those of us who know and honor the sacred weed, the healing power of cannabis and of CBD, we've all heard about, and some of us have heard some of the truly remarkable, almost miraculous stories of what's been accomplished with this herb. And I think it's appropriate to have the person who in this room has done more work for longer to normalize and legalize pot say a couple of words about the sacred aspect and the healing aspect of pot, and that's Bruce Margolin, who runs NORML in LA and has been at this for 51 years as a lawyer. Please.
Thank you, Marty. Appreciate the introduction. I welcome all of you on behalf of NORML. We're the co-sponsors with Digital Hollywood for your luncheon today, and that's an honor to do that and buddy up with Digital Hollywood. You can see the kind of venue they put together and the kind of lunch we put together. Now, talking about the spiritual use or the medical use of marijuana is certainly part of my game. It's what I'm down for because that's where I see it. In particular, when I first started my practice in 1967, I started defending marijuana cases. I've continually done it for 51 years. And I remember when I first started my practice, I had some Hispanic clients come into my office and tell me, we don't smoke it, we use it for back compressors when we have pains in our back. And I thought, well, that was a joke. They were trying to get around it, that they were actually using it. But since then, I can't tell you the number of stories that I've heard from people that have been affected in such positive ways over the use of the sacred herb. Now, to say why, how it does it, or what it does, and it's something for the medical field to be able to better describe. But there's no question about it. The gentleman just came up to me just now and talked about how it saved his life. I hear about it daily from people calling me on my phone. And all I can say is that this is a special time in our society that's opening up an opportunity for healing and for help for people that need it. Whether it's emotional, psychological, philosophical, or physical, it works. So we must help this, the opportunity for people to have access to it. And that's what NORML does. We represent the consumer and have represented the consumer since 1972. And we've done best we can to make that happen. And now we're working diligently on providing for, as I mentioned earlier in one of my presentations, about getting on-site consumption locations in the city of Los Angeles, in which Kat Packer is very on board for. We met yesterday, matter of fact. And as Marty says, this is a vital time, not only for Los Angeles, not only for California, not only for the United States of America, but for the whole world, for LA to lead the way in getting rational and reasonable laws. And you can help by participating and giving your opinion to these different legislators and people that are in charge, because they want to hear from you badly. So I commend you for being here, and I offer you the opportunity to help us go forward with making people have the choice, letting them have the choice to use the herb if they want to, and make sure we have the right kind of people leading the way. Thank you very much.
So we're going to keep this in the family. The next person to speak will be that man's daughter, Madison Margolin, and she will run a colloquy with two remarkable experts on the healing properties of cannabis.
Hi, so I'm a cannabis journalist. I write for Mary Jane, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Miss Grass, High Times, a bunch of publications. And here's Sue Sisley and Tracy Ryan, both of whom I've gotten to know through my journalism. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Ryan. I am the CEO of a company called Cannabis and also the founder of a nonprofit called Saving Sophie. I originally got into this industry over 5 years ago when my little girl Sophie was diagnosed with a very rare brain tumor. Through a chain of events on social media, I was connected to Ricky Lake and Abby Epstein, who had just begun filming a documentary called Weed the People, which is actually hitting theaters later this month. We're very excited about that. And we went on this incredible journey using cannabis on my daughter. She consumed for the first time at 9 months old. And she has been a medical miracle more times than anyone can count, including her oncologist, her neurologist, her neurosurgeons, her ophthalmologist, and so forth. And through that, I created a line of oils where we have worked with patients all over the world, but treated patients both young and old in California through some of the most successful stories that I believe float around this industry. We have learned a lot about this plant, and we've now dove headfirst into research, which is a lot of what I believe we're going to talk about today. So I'll leave that for a few minutes from now.
That's it. Tracy is a true champion. Yeah, exactly. So, my name is Sue Sisley. I'm a physician based in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm the president and principal investigator at Scottsdale Research Institute, where we conduct controlled trials on cannabis flower. So we're just looking strictly at dry bud, at smoked and vaporized flower, trying to put flower through the entire FDA drug development process in an effort to eventually get an FDA indication to be on the market, and also to persuade then insurance companies to be forced to pay for flower just like they do in Israel. And I think that the one thing I wanted to emphasize is that and hopefully we'll get to talk about this later, is that there are really serious barriers to research, especially if you dare say you want to study effectiveness of cannabis. Those are the studies that have been systematically impeded by our government for decades. The one barrier that's still really onerous right now is the DEA NIDA monopoly. So this is the situation where our cannabis must be purchased from the University of Mississippi whenever we do controlled trials. So when Tracy wants to study her products, she's not able to do a controlled trial because the government has said you're only allowed to buy this really low quality plant material from the University of Mississippi. So we're hopefully going to touch on that later, but that's a lot of our work, is trying to shine a spotlight on the barriers to research. Most of our research right now is focused on military veterans. As you know, we have an epidemic of veteran suicide in the U.S., and we're hoping that this research will uncover new treatments for dealing with PTSD, chronic pain, and other common illnesses that veterans struggle with. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just to get a little bit more information on the scope of both of your research, Tracy, could you explain how, what you found in regard to how cannabis is actually targeting Sophie's brain tumor? And Sue, how does cannabis function as a treatment for the symptoms of PTSD? resistant.
Sure, I'll try. Yeah, let me. So we think, cannabis seems, by the way, I've been very skeptical for years. I was trained in a really conservative medical model where we don't, we physicians don't view anything as medicine unless it's been put through the FDA process. And so it took me probably a decade of listening to military vets in my own clinical practice who were claiming that they were benefiting from cannabis for all sorts of ailments, not just their PTSD symptoms, but all kinds of illnesses were being relieved, and I was, dubious. But finally, we have thousands of controlled trials that are already published in peer-reviewed medical journals that are highlighting the benefits of this plant. And what's really valuable is that rather than like the traditional pharma model, big pharma has persuaded, has taught us, brainwashed us that you need to have one molecule targeting one receptor in the body, and that's the way that's the traditional medical model. And in fact, this plant is so complex. Michael, I'm sure we'll touch on this later. The complexity of the plant is truly marvelous, and the ability for this plant to target many different receptors in different organ systems throughout the body is really powerful treatment opportunity, and it's really working. And for example, with PTSD, a very complex syndrome, it has over 10 different target symptoms, from the chronic insomnia, anxiety, hypervigilance, depressed mood, all these different things. So traditionally in medicine, we would treat every target symptom with a different prescription. So that's why these PTSD patients feel so demoralized, because they end up on 8 to 10 different prescriptions just to treat one illness, PTSD. And with the notion that the cannabis plant can treat the entire array of really disabling symptoms with this one plant is really fascinating, exciting, and that's why we're working on controlled trials to really persuade medical community, or not to persuade, we're collecting objective data on how this plant works, how it doesn't work. We put all of the data into the public domain. So the good and the bad of cannabis will all be published for everyone to scrutinize, unlike big pharma that suppresses data that doesn't make their drug look favorable. We put everything into the public domain. So that's because we're a nonprofit and we're trying to do a good community service. So that's it. Yeah.
So my daughter Sophie's brain tumor is very rare. It equates for only 5% of all pediatric brain tumors, and pediatrics get 3.8% of all government funding for research. Adults get 96.2%. So no one is going to do a clinical trial on my child. Number one, because the kind of tumor she has a 90% survival rate, albeit an 85% recurrence rate, hence the reason we are now year 5 of our treatment. But without me heading up some sort of research for her, we just have to keep hoping that at some point, one of these protocols is actually going to work. They're actually trying to put her back on chemo again now on Friday, because we've kept her stable, we've kept her from going blind, but every once in a while it'll start to adjust to the drugs and they'll start to grow a little bit. One of the challenges that we were having with this new area of disease over the last year is that we couldn't really get it to stop, so it was getting quite large. So in April, we decided to go in and take a big scoop out of this tumor after consulting with every single different department that helps treat my child. And I knew that this was going to be my one chance to actually get research done for Sophie. So I worked harder than I've ever worked in my entire life. I've never been so stressed, literally, in my 43 years of being on this planet. And I was lucky enough to get dropped into the lap of a brilliant research scientist. Her name's Dr. Jewett, and she is the world leader in the study of NK cells. NK cells are natural killer cells that are in our immune system that identify cancer stem cells that we all have living in our body. With healthy people, our NK cell function keeps those cancer stem cells from acting up, keeps us from getting cancer, so we thrive. In 100% of Dr. Jewett's patients that she studied over the last 30 years, none of them have a functioning NK cell system. So I originally had brought Sophie's tumor to her, originally just to do what's called patient-derived xenograft, where she would take Sophie's tumor tissue and implant it into animal models. which is kind of cool. The kind of animals that she has, her mice actually pump human blood. They're very, very specific type of mice that have gone through a very special process. So their immune system is the same as ours. So when you're doing trials in these humanized mice, it's much more accurate than doing it in a typical rodent that's only about 80% similar to us. There's a big difference between success in a rodent than jumping into a human trial and finding success there. There's a pretty big failure rate. So when I got Dr. Jewett Sophie's tumor tissue, she did the implantation, but she really started looking at Sophie's NK cell function, started looking at her blood, and what she found was absolutely groundbreaking. She could not explain why my daughter's immune system was working so much better than a healthy person's. So we then decided to take 2 more of our success stories and enroll them. One of our boys had 90 days to live with metastatic osteosarcoma. It's a bone cancer. He'd recurred 6 times in 3 years. They could not keep him cancer-free. In those 90 days, in which time he was supposed to succumb to his disease, we got him cancer-free using our Cannabis oil. And for the last 3.5 years, he hasn't had one single recurrence using cannabis alone. We started studying him. Thank you. We started studying his blood, and we, too, found the same thing in his blood that we found in Sophie's. We enrolled one more child named Morgan, brainstem tumor, should have succumbed to her disease almost 3 years ago now. These tumors don't shrink at all, ever, even though we shrank it once by 50%, stabilized for a few years, started to grow again. We shrank it by 77% the second time. We're now finding the same thing in her blood that we're finding in Sophie and in AJ's. We've got 2 adult patients now, and now we're raising a ton of money to expand that research because we do now believe that we are onto something extraordinarily groundbreaking when it comes to the immune system. Originally, these mice were going to go to Israel, where we're also funding 4 years of research at the Technion Institute for both pediatric and adult cancer, but those mice are now staying here. And now Dr. Jewett and I are working diligently to raise the funds that we need to raise to expand this trial, work towards human trials, reverse engineer what we're doing in the animals, and get better medical products to the market for cancer for both children and adults alike.
So what they're both working on is fascinating, but probably for those of you who don't know, and I assume most people at this point know, cannabis is still a Schedule I drug, which means it's in the same category as drugs like heroin, which according to the federal government means there's no accepted medical use or value, and meanwhile, here we are. So I guess what I want to ask the 2 of you again is, or in addition to this, is how have you been able to get around the government scheduling in regard to carrying out your research? And then how do you go ahead and get funding for it?
Yeah, no, you raise a really important point because, it took us 7 years to navigate all the government regulatory hurdles. We finally started that FDA trial 3 years ago, but it shouldn't take 7 years to do a study that already had FDA approval, fully funded with IRB approval. It doesn't make sense, and it just shows you the myriad ways that our government, the strategies the government has developed to block this work. And I can say that I have firsthand knowledge of how absurd this is because I work with MAPS. Many of you know MAPS is a nonprofit that does all the seminal studies on psychedelics like MDMA, ecstasy, LSD. And so years ago, we began doing research on MDMA and cannabis at the same time, and yet our MDMA research is already at the end of FDA phase 3 trials, and yet cannabis is still stuck at FDA phase 2. So I think we all agree that it's insane that cannabis is even lumped into Schedule I, but the fact that it has the most severe barriers to research compared to these other psychedelics, it makes no sense to anyone who's, medically oriented. So I would say the only other thing I'd bring up is just that, the final barrier to research is ending the DEA monopoly and forcing DEA to license other growers for research. So whatever you can do to help us with that, we'd really appreciate it.
Well, and for us, the way that we're getting around it right now is we're studying the blood of patients who have consumed cannabis. So we're reverse engineering the way science is usually done. We're looking at the patients who have first been successful and trying to figure out why they were successful, and then how do we replicate that. Some of the other things that I'm in the planning processes of right now with one of the top, #1 pediatric hospital in California, top 5 in the country, is doing what we call observational studies, where we will actually bring the cannabis to the patients in the hospital, have the caregiver then give it to the nurse, have the nurse log it, then when it's time for the medicine, give it back to the caregiver. The caregiver then gives the dose to the patient, and then we track the blood from that. We're literally trying to do everything we can to figure out a way around this. I call myself the person who figures out how to drive around the potholes of life, and the DEA right now is a major pothole for us. We do have some exciting new alliances that we're working with that want to help us get that Schedule I license at the university in which Dr. Jewett works at. Because she's at a university, we hope that that will move quickly, but it is a challenge. It is a monster undertaking. It is extraordinarily expensive, and for anyone in the room who wants to support this financially or otherwise, please come and find us, because this takes a village and we cannot do this alone.
Thank you. So, hand it over to Marty.
Thank you so much. Eben Britton, a former offensive lineman, is on the board of Athletes for Care, and he has personal testimony about the utility of CBD and cannabis-derived drugs.
Thank you. Geez, I mean, after hearing these two powerhouses, I don't know if there's much I can add. Yeah. Is it lunchtime? So what am I doing here? I played 6 years in the NFL. I suffered a laundry list of injuries. The way that is, well, first of all, from back injuries, shoulder surgery, back surgery, handful of concussions, etc. Pretty much the typical menu of NFL player injuries. And the way that is dealt with in the NFL is lots of pharmaceutical prescription pills, whether that's highly toxic anti-inflammatories like Cataflam, Indocin, things that wreak havoc on our digestive system, on our liver and kidneys, to opiates. And we all understand, or at least are beginning to see, the wreckage, the destruction that opiates are causing, with 70,000 plus deaths a year. And that's prescribed dosages that people are dying on. And so, these pills, they really, that being the typical form of pain management, that, you go into the locker room with an injury, you head into the training room, and you're given a prescription pill, and you're told to take this stuff every day to deal with just regular aches and pains. So you're on a daily prescription of some really powerful anti-inflammatory. And then, before games, you're given Vicodin. After games, you're given Vicodin or some other opiate. And these things had a terrible effect on me. I felt a really negative effect. I actually had my DNA tested recently, and not that this is unique to me, but I do have a gene, a genetic variant, where I am more susceptible to the side effects of opiates. That being, I was experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms after 3 days of use, as prescribed by the doctor. Waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a knifing sensation in my gut, cold sweats, chills, unable to sleep, unable to recover. And so being a kid who was raised by very holistically minded parents, for whatever reason, I very much gravitated towards cannabis, towards the cannabis plant in my football career, specifically in the NFL, because this was a plant that I could come home after a long day of grind. I could, for lack of a better term, smoke a joint. And because, in Jacksonville and Chicago, it's a reason we need to embrace legalization, full legalization, full descheduling of the plant. All I had access to was, a bag of flower, marijuana. And so I could come home and I could pop these pills, which made me feel insane, which put me in more discomfort than I was in before the injury, made it difficult to sleep, made it difficult to heal. Taking opiates, I felt just totally irrational and out of my mind. You come home playing football, you're in a highly adrenalized state. You've been running on cortisol and adrenaline, testosterone for hours and hours for 10 plus years. You know, these guys in the NFL, that's why we see so many instances of domestic violence, alcoholism, you know, off the field issues, because these guys, after years and years of this, can't turn the switch off when they get home. So it's very difficult to come back into an environment where you have to be a father, you have to be a partner to your wife, and try to integrate yourself back into a family atmosphere. So combining pills into that mix, which just amplify all of these issues, you know, makes it much worse. And so for me, I always went to cannabis. And so the NFL's current policy is cannabis is a banned substance. You get tested for it once a year on the annual street drugs test. So you have a general idea of when that's coming, and you know, if you're mindful of the rules and when that test is happening, you can navigate that process pretty easily. So the test comes sometime between when you report back to camp or report back to your team in April to about the first week of training camp in August. So you have this window. So once you get tested, you're able to consume cannabis as you need it. And so for me, you know, coming home, I could consume some cannabis. It decompressed me physically and emotionally, helped me rejuvenate for another day of the grind. You know, you've got a 2-hour weight lift, you've got a 2-hour full padded practice where you're smashing into another individual 100 plus times a day. You've got 6 hours of meetings, you know, you've got nonstop football, you know, for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for, you know, however many years you're in it. And so for me, you know, coming out of my career and really feeling like cannabis was a huge part of my healing process, not only in football, but coming out of it and my transition into regular life. You know, the NFL has two major problems. That's opiate abuse. NFL players are 4 times as likely to abuse opiates as the average American. And then concussions and CTE, this thing called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is, you know, the result of repetitive brain trauma. Concussions over and over again. Me playing offensive line, we are at the highest risk of getting CTE. And so CTE is a degenerative neurological disorder, which leads you to early onset dementia, Alzheimer's. I know guys who are in their early 40s who have already been diagnosed with stage 2 dementia and Alzheimer's. These are men with families. These are guys who their families are falling apart. They don't know how to relate to the world. And, you know, on top of these physical injuries, have had a complete loss of identity and loss of sense of themselves. And so those two things combined, you know, a spiritual lacking, an emotional lacking, a physical lacking in your life really leads to this early departure, for lack of a better term. And so cannabis, I don't know, raise your guys' hand if you know that the federal government has a patent on cannabinoids as neuroprotectants and antioxidants. That's pretty good. So that means that our government has already done studies, has already done the research. Maybe Michael can add to this after the fact. But they've already seen that these cannabinoids, these chemical compounds, can help heal the brain from trauma and can also protect the brain from future trauma. Now, with the NFL having its biggest issue being brain trauma, concussions, and CTE, you can't turn on a football game these days without seeing the NFL's paid-for PSA talking about how much they care about the safety of the players and the new technology of the helmets. Well, I got news for you guys. That shit ain't gonna cut it. These are still 250 to 350 pound men running at the speed of light, smashing into each other, and there's a lot of damage that occurs. And so cannabinoids really offer the #1 solution to that issue. They can also, in my opinion, be an alternative to opiates and all the prescription drugs that are dealt to the players. So for the NFL, you know, this is a major issue for player wellness and player safety, and it's a major issue for the NFL. I mean, you're going to have healthier players leaving the league, less lawsuits, less money spent on your bottom line in pharmaceutical drugs, and so I think it's a win-win. So I created an organization called Athletes for Care to really help spearhead this athlete's voice in this movement. So that's a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Michael Backus wrote an encyclopedia on the pharmacology of cannabinoids and cannabis, and he'll enlighten us.
Let's hope. Thanks. So I got into this as a patient. I had a kind of migraine that didn't respond particularly well to conventional medications. A friend recommended that I try cannabis for it. And what I found was cannabis was prophylaxis for my headaches, which means that if I used a very, very small amount of cannabis a couple times a week, my headache frequency dropped dramatically. Much later, I started working with Ethan Russo, who'd come up with this idea of endocannabinoid deficiency, and the idea that some of these ailments, like migraine, fibromyalgia, et cetera, may actually be linked to the body's inability to regulate its own endocannabinoid system. But I want to talk about two big things. One is, a lot of people think the war is over, okay, and that we've won, and let me disabuse you. In January, there's a book coming out from Simon & Schuster called Tell Your Children. Some of you may recognize that phrase. It's from Reefer Madness. Wow. Okay? And it's a book about the insanity and violence caused by cannabis. Okay? It's being published by Simon & Schuster, written by a Yale graduate who's written for the New York Times. And he's reached across the pond to Peter Hitchens, the stupider brother of Chris Hitchens, and they have teamed up to basically take on cannabis in the press beginning in 2019, and it will have an impact, and we have to be prepared for it. Now, what's great is they're bringing up a lot of arguments that are easily countered if you know how to counter them. One of them is that cannabis causes insanity. Well, it turns out that THC can trigger psychotic reactions in susceptible individuals. However, if you add CBD to the mix, that doesn't happen. And that's been shown in brain scanning experiments at NIH, conducted by Nora Volkow, head of NIDA, in Australia and in the UK. And so the thing is that CBD works like a safety belt for THC. Simple as that. And what happened is that prohibition encouraged CBD to be bred out of cannabis. And now we're seeing it come back. But it's as simple as this. If you simply just take a CBD tincture in the morning, and I don't really recommend it in the afternoon because of a study that came out 3 days ago that shows that small doses of CBD are wake promoting, and the reason they're wake promoting is they adjust your genes that control your circadian clock. So, take it early in the day, okay, so you sleep well at night. A lot of people will give you very bad advice and say, oh, CBD is great for sleep, all right? Not so much, all right? And if you're going to take it early in the day and use THC at night for sleep. It seems to work a lot better. But back to this. We're in a war. We win the war by knowing more than our opponents, okay? We learn more than our opponents by actually studying the plant that we're interested in, okay? And it doesn't mean you have to go back and get, your doctorate in biochemistry. But what it means is you really have to start to pay attention to how this works. And it's a very complex plant. But most dispensaries in the United States don't carry a complex version of cannabis. Most dispensaries are loaded up on limonene, caryophyllene, myrcene, LCM plants, okay, cushes, or more recently, cookies, which is a caryophyllene dominant plant, and they're all super high in THC. And the thing is that what we want more diversity in the essential oils that our plants produce so that we have more options. Okay? Right now, basically, this plant is an extraordinary factory for a lot of very, very interesting compounds. Cannabinoids and essential oils, the terpenes and terpenoids. But we need to encourage that. And you encourage it with your pocketbook. Okay? You walk in and you ask, I want something different. What do you have that's different? And right now, most cannabis is really, really high in myrcene. And that's good news and bad news. Myrcene is biphasic, as are most cannabis compounds, which means it does one thing at a low dose and another thing at a high dose. Example, THC. THC reduces anxiety at low doses and can cause anxiety at high doses. All right? Different cannabinoids can have opposite effects. THC helps you withstand heat because it triggers a particular receptor, a trip receptor, that helps us withstand hot weather. CBD, on the other hand, triggers the menthol receptor, the cold receptor, and it helps you withstand cold. So if you're going out to the beach for the day and you're worried about the heat, or you're living in a world that has global warming, THC will be your friend. You go up to the mountains, CBD is going to be your friend. Understanding the vast range of choices available to you and demanding them can really change your relationship to the plant. Okay? And you also have to realize there's just an enormous amount of nonsense out there. Okay? Real nonsense. I'll give you an example. There are 2 or 3 companies in the United States right now offering to sequence the genome of your cannabis plant. Okay? George Church at Harvard has a really, really interesting response to sequencing for pay. The data that the company gets for sequencing your plant is so valuable, they should be paying you. And you should at least co-own that data. Okay? Because George Church, who basically is into sequencing human genomes, says 23andMe, Ancestry.com, these companies are effectively scams because they're going to make a lot more money off the data they get from you than you would ever pay them, but you're paying them anyway. All right? So be really suspicious of people who offer you something that's going to protect you or you know, it seems too good to be true.
Great. Super. Thank you, Michael. There's a lot to know, and knowledge will be our friend and also the foe of this, the opposite side, and legislatively, the people we have to persuade to basically do the right thing, particularly in the medical domain. So I'd like to open our panel to questions, if that's okay, and I'm sure there'll be some. Sir.
Interestingly, my name is Ranji, and I run a global broadcast network. My partners were paid for by NIH. We developed stem cells from plants, and you can see it on our website, NASA using it. We brought it back and created a pharmaceutical grade product. We're giving it out to friends to test it. Personally, I have about 1,000 friends that went from 4th stage cancer to total remission, over 1,000 cures. So we shipped the whole operation to Mexico. If you want treatment, you go to Thailand. Now our facility is small, but we also have the institutions in Hungary, and they're testing with mice. The results have been phenomenal. So my question is, will some of that results be acceptable if you collaborate with the medical institutions?
So Dr. Sue, I think this is for you.
Yeah, I can try. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely, they do recognize, especially the FDA values only controlled trials, so they will accept controlled trials from other countries that have been published in peer-reviewed medical journals that have, ethics committee approval in advance. So that is, ultimately, you'd still have to replicate them in the U.S. if you wanted to get your drug on the market. But Tracy can tell, she's doing studies all over the world.
Yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing in Israel as well. Israel can be recognized in the United States, but you still have to go through additional steps in the United States to bring that drug here.
So what Rajiv said is he has participated in a trial, limited trial, 1,000 folk, and you use stem cells that you were... Yeah. So this is fairly complex business, but the boil down is that there are tests that have been done in Canada. Now you also exported some of this information and the samples to Mexico and Hungary. And the point that Dr. Sue made is that these things have to be replicated in the States for it to be implemented in a drug that would be used in the United States. I have to move on, Rajiv, to another thing. Well, thank you, sir.
Sue.
What other programs are you running in regards to hemp? Because I know when I worked at the VA as a legal analyst, they have a policy that allows the veterans to get into the cannabis space provided they're in the medical program of the state. But no one's talking about hemp and the difference between cannabis and marijuana. Three different things from one plant in no sativa health. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely.
And repeat the question.
Yeah, no, you're touching on this most important hemp revolution we're seeing is finally taking hold. Different, we have over 40 states that have state laws on the book to support industrial hemp production and processing. Unfortunately, until we end the DEA monopoly, I will continue to be forced to buy CBD, CBD-rich cannabis from the University of Mississippi. So fortunately, Tracy, she creates her own CBD-rich products. But if you wanted, we're trying to do controlled trials to get through the FDA process. And whenever you do controlled trials, we'll have to continue buying from University of Mississippi until I just want to point out that the DEA made an announcement back in 2016 under the Obama administration that they would finally end the monopoly and allow other expert growers in the country to provide study drug-like CBD products. But they never made good on that pledge. It was, if you go on the Federal Register, you can read the DEA announcement, but it was not accompanied by any timeline. So when the DEA makes an announcement without any timetable, it's probably not going to happen. And we've been lobbying, we've threatened lawsuits against the DEA. Apparently Jeff Sessions and DOJ are blocking the DEA's ability to proceed.
Well, and just recently, when Epidiolex was approved as an FDA drug showing medical benefit, they also had 90 days from the date of that approval process to deschedule CBD. And they did, but they only descheduled it for drugs that are already FDA approved. So it went down to Schedule 5, but we still can't study it. And that's the problem. And I'm really excited about, I used to be very anti-hemp when I first got into this because I wasn't educated properly and there was a lot of really poor hemp products on the market. But now knowing what I know about CBD, you can make a beautiful strain as long as it's cannabinoid rich and not just like, 1 or 2 cannabinoids in it with a full terpene profile. And I've literally firsthand experience in working with a child that had a 2% chance of surviving the bone marrow transplant process, not even surviving the bone marrow transplant as a whole, but just the process. And not only did she breeze through that process, but she was released from the hospital 35 days early, if not more. And every time she went for a checkup, she was 6 to 8 months ahead in the healing process. And now 3 years later, she's cancer-free after having cancer for 6 years. And she's using CBD hemp, quote unquote, from us.
Yeah. So life, keep your eye on that federal farm bill, because everybody's anticipating that will then fully deschedule CBD derived from hemp and will change the entire environment. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, what we're seeing it do for leukemia is groundbreaking. In one of our trials in Israel, we're already in human tissue, just about ready to go into human beings, and we are completely eradicating 2 different types of leukemia with cannabis alone.
That's amazing.
By the way, thank you for your service as well.
Yeah,
That's it. The gentleman is working with veterans and PTSD using cannabinoids. Yes, sir. Yeah, Michael. Mike.
And the difference between flower, concentrate, tinctures, edibles, in the veracity of those claims.
Yeah, I mean, it's, okay, so most topical products are ridiculously underpowered, all right? I've gone into shops that carried 100 different CBD products and maybe 2 were strong enough to actually move the needle topically, okay? So what you're looking for is you're looking in topical products for very potent products. Orally, you've got another problem, and that is your body's basically designed to break down plant chemicals before they get to your bloodstream when you swallow them. That's a war that goes back 350 million years between plants and animals, okay? And it's how your body basically protects you from things that could have been toxic if they weren't protecting you. So now you're starting to see things like nanoencapsulation. You're starting to see people figure out ways to get things orally into the bloodstream, more complex entourages. Terpenes, if somebody tells you they're giving you a sativa edible, they're lying to you, okay? I mean, they're just lying. And they'll say, oh, no, it really works. They're just lying, or they don't know, all right? So pick one. The best way to get things into your bloodstream currently is inhaling them. You can get very, very complex entourages, but you have to have a very, very clean product, and you have to be careful about the amounts of the product. For example, you put a lot of limonene into an e-pen, you're basically using the same thing on your lungs that they use to degrease engines, okay? So you really want to have a light touch with terpenes that are inhaled, especially if they work like solvents like limonene does. So the point is, I think there is an enormous amount of efficacy to be uncovered. The thing that has to happen is a pharmacological fingerprint for the formulation, all right? Which means what receptors are either going to be, they're either going to be basically inhibited or excited by a chemical, and there are lots of different receptors that are going to be hit by these things. You need to figure out what the product can do, and then, if you're trying to treat a symptom, how all those receptors are either overexpressed or underexpressed. And that's what's called a therapeutic handshake. And it's really tricky, and there's a lot to it, and we're probably close to a decade from really understanding it, but we're on the path. Pay attention to companies that dive deep into how their products work. Don't always listen to the survivorship bias that shows up around these products. In other words, if you have somebody treating a life-threatening illness with a cannabis product, all right, well, you're only going to hear from the people who survive, all right, not the ones who used it and did not survive. So that has to be balanced. All right, and it's a problem with all medicines. It's all herbal medicines is that, oh, look, I survived X, okay? But the 4 people who didn't aren't here to say, well, frankly, it didn't work for me.
Well said.
I think
so we're recording this proceeding, so if you want to ask a question, just line up and talk into this microphone.
Marty,
Right.
can I just weigh in really quickly on that just for a few minutes? I think it really depends on what you're treating too. I would not give a kid with leukemia a vape pen, but I would give them a tincture or a thin film or, you know, something else that they can, even rectal suppositories, even though I don't really like suppositories. I think if you have acute pain, if you have PTSD, if you have insomnia, if you have something that's really hitting you hard and you need something that's fast acting, a vape pen is always going to be the fastest thing to hit you. But we all metabolize things differently, and we also respond to this plant in a very different way. My husband is almost 6'5", and he's like twice my size. I can take 4 times the amount of cannabis that he can. He'll be on the floor if he tries to even kind of catch up to me, and I'll just be popping those chocolate-covered blueberries like they're candy, and I'll burn right through them. But that's because I metabolize things much faster, and he's a slow metabolizer. It's the same with drinking. We can both have a glass of wine. I'll feel nothing, and he'll have a buzz, and he'll be done. So you really, with cannabis, you have to first figure out what is it that you're treating. I always recommend, if it's something serious, speaking to a medical professional that understands both the disease itself, the Western medicine that you're taking, the pharmaceuticals that you're putting into your body, to ensure that they're not processing through the same liver enzymes, because they can block each other. With epilepsy especially, you want to be very careful about how you're giving those drugs and opioids as well, because they potentiate the effect of opioids. There's a titration plan that needs to go along with some of these different medicines. That's why we have nurses. You don't have to use our products. You can just come to our website and book a consult with a nurse that's gone through extensive training, and they too can help guide you on what products they think are going to be best for you. Like I said, you don't have to use Cannabis. You can use whatever you want. We just want you to use what's right for you, and everyone is individual, and that's why the kind of research we're doing is truly focused on an individualized, personalized medicine approach.
Wonderful.
So, Marty, your question about where are the studies that justify the use of these products, and I'll tell you that generally these producers are making millions of dollars selling products that have never had a single pharmacokinetic study to even understand how much is absorbed, how much is bioavailable in the blood or the urine, just like traditional pharmaceutical products. So it is challenging. That's why you don't see a lot of physicians jumping into this realm yet, because physicians respond to controlled trials. We guide patients based on controlled data, and the American cannabis industry has not invested, in the industry side does not pay for controlled trials because it's millions of dollars. But the good news is, hundreds of millions, right? Yeah. So you look at the experience with GW, what it took them, probably over $50 million to get through Epidiolex through the entire FDA process. Maybe about $1 billion. But yeah, but what's interesting is the Canadian LPs are starting to understand the importance of this as they are all trying to distinguish themselves, and some of the larger LPs that are worth, that have multi-billion-dollar market caps are finally allocating millions of dollars to doing the kind of clinical trials that are required to answer your questions about what are these products really doing, how much is getting absorbed. But ultimately, right now, it's still just like what Tracy described. It's still each patient has to go on their own personal journey. It's like a personal odyssey, experimenting with different products at the lowest dosages and seeing what you react well to. And fortunately, groups are forming online and other places where, patients are teaching each other how to use these products, and it's helpful, and because they can't rely on their physician to guide them. And so when Life mentioned earlier about the veterans community, the vets are all, coaching, mentoring each other on how to experiment with different products and get some benefit that way.
There is one resource that's really good that's freely available. It's in Canada. It's called Drug Bank. Okay? And Drug Bank, you can look up cannabidiol and basically any medicine in the world, and it'll tell you if there are interactions. You can do the same thing for THC. And it's super easy to use, super clearly.
It's a great site.
It's a great site.
Great site, yeah.
And it'll give you a heads up on if there are interactions between the 2 major cannabinoids and anything you're currently taking.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Philip Rebentish, host of the podcast Cannabis for the Rest of Us. And to follow up on this line of questioning, I hear two terms a lot, the entourage effect and full spectrum plant. Can you all weigh in on that? Are those just marketing terms that we're hearing?
No, not at all. I mean,
take that, Mike?
yeah, sure. So the entourage was coined by Rafi Meshulam when he was referring to basically cannabinoids. He wasn't really interested in cannabis essential oils / terpenes when he first came up. And what he was noticing, and it's the reason GW formulated Sativex to have THC and CBD, is that they are synergistic with one another. It's a very, very real effect, but it's also very overhyped. So there are definitely entourage effects between cannabinoids and each other and cannabinoids and terpenes, all right? There is increasing evidence that there are some cannabinoids out there that are actually very, very potent pharmacologically that aren't commonly tested for, that may be present in a lot of cannabis products. So I'm a huge fan of the evidence base that supports whole plant extracts as opposed to just this reductionist approach of just tearing the plant apart into all these different compounds, okay? I think the wisdom of nature here is quite extraordinary. So if we can characterize these plants, we can get whole plant extracts that are potentially much more valuable than just using a single molecule.
Yeah, in Israel, where we're doing our research, what we're doing is we're breaking the plant apart. Once we find a strain that eradicates the disease in a machine model by 100%. They then break that plant apart and they reassemble it piece by piece until they get down to the smallest amount of compounds they need to recreate that efficacy. And our leukemia profile has 6 compounds. It has 2 secondary and tertiary cannabinoids, not even THC and CBD, and then like 4 terpenes in it. So whole plant can mean a lot of different things. I think that what you just have to watch out for are isolated compounds, because when it comes to really high therapeutic value, you're not getting that entourage effect with just like an isolate CBD, for example.
Yeah. And we're hoping, just to build on what these guys said, we're hoping that natural flower will also find a safe, secure place in the market, because flower, we don't really understand all the molecules that are lost during extraction when we strip out. There's certain molecules that can't be preserved in extraction. We don't know what all is lost, and we want to provide a sanctuary for dry flower to still be on the market alongside of all these wonderful products.
And to support what Sue said, the great thing about flower vaporizers as opposed to oil vaporizers is that they can deliver a very, very complex entourage if you're patient enough. Mm-hmm. The thing is that a flower vaporizer works like smoking in slow motion. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is the essential oils come off first, then the cannabinoids, but because the essential oils have the taste and the cannabinoids don't, people are often impatient and stop having inhaled most of the terpenes and only a fraction of the cannabinoids. Huh. So what you have to have is you have to have the patience to go all the way and start with a much smaller amount, because I guarantee you that when you completely vaporize that piece of flower, you're going to feel a much more potent effect than you normally might experience if you were not so patient.
So is that how the term "you got to cough to get off" came around? That like you really have to take all that in and cough, because once you cough, you are high every time.
I don't equate efficacy and lung irritation. Okay, so what I do is I start with a very small piece of flour and vaporize it completely, and I don't cough at all, but it really works.
Yeah. Next question, please.
Yes, I'm Ken Sobel from San Diego, and hi, Dr. Sue. Hi, Evan. So I've been attending these types of conferences for well over a decade, and this is a really distinguished panel, and you've all given some excellent remarks so far. So Dr. Sue and I actually were on the forefront of the battle to get cannabis qualified for use for victims of post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly our returning veterans and women who have been the victims of domestic abuse. And we were successful in doing that in Arizona, and then virtually every state now has adopted it. And I'm currently working on cannabis villages. We'll do one in San Diego that will combine not only our supply chain, but we'll have a medical clinic attached to it, so we can do clinical studies as well. But the point, I was wondering if any of you have addressed the issue yet of the California Department of Public Health's position on using hemp, American hemp, CBD from American hemp as part of the material or products that we use in our cannabis dispensaries. The CDPH recently issued a rule that said we can no longer use CBD derived from American hemp, and I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts or comments on it.
I've got a whole bag of issues that I'm dealing with right now with regulatory in California. It is burying my company and all of my friends' companies alongside us. It is absolutely crazy what we are going through right now. I heard the whispers and the letters about them saying that hemp cannot be used in California anymore because there's no regulatory. They can't make their money off of us. And it's really unfortunate. I mean, people are still selling it. They're still making it. They're still moving forward with that process. I'm in the plans of starting my own hemp company so I can go nationwide with more of a whole plan approach. Like I was talking about, using a little girl that was really sick and it worked. We know how to build those strains. But if they screw with us in California on hemp, I'm just going to go manufacture out of the state and start shipping it from there, because I think that's what a lot of people are having to do that are concerned.
And just as a last addition to that, you can sell high-ratio medicinal cannabis plants, the CBD component from it, but you now have to prove with the COA that it's not derived from American hemp. And also the other thing that I would say, as far as, I've seen some grows for hemp plants out in the middle of Death Valley, literally outdoors, and they're the most beautiful and exceptional plants you've ever seen, with about a 15% CBD ratio. So we can grow that plant anywhere. And thank you again, all of you, for being on this panel, and Evan for being a University of Arizona graduate like myself.
Just a note that if you want to add CBD hemp or some sort of CBD product to your coffee, or if there was a coffee shop in San Diego and around San Diego that got in trouble because they were adding CBD to their coffees. So if it's CBD derived from a marijuana plant, that needs to be sold in a dispensary, versus CBD that's derived from a hemp plant that's outside the scope of California's adult use and medical marijuana program.
Yeah, we have a topical that it's actually one of the good ones, Michael. I have to let you try it. But it's got CBD isolate in that from hemp, and there's a lot of other things in it that make it work the way that it does. But we've had to take it off the shelves because it has CBD isolate that's hemp derived, even though it's just the one single molecule. So there's a lot of really big challenges that this industry is facing right now in a plant that is the most medicinal thing I've ever seen in the history of my life.
Big challenges with small molecules. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you about children and cannabis. You mentioned Weed the People, which is a great film.
Thank you.
And then there's a new film that came out recently called Flipping the Script, about parents getting fed up with the medical industry, pulling their kids off long-term chemo, finding that cannabis, nutrition, and detox work just fine. These kids are surviving anywhere from 6 months to 5 years. They're testing them regularly. There's no more leukemia, no more lymphoma. I mean, it's working really well. So my question is, and maybe Dr. Su, you could address this, what do we need to do to get the medical profession to at least accept on a basic level that there is something other than chemotherapy, that there is something other than forced 2 to 4 years of chemotherapy that's ending up with brain damage, organ failure, relapse, and death? And we saw these kids in Weed the People that were so destroyed by chemotherapy that they turned to cannabis, and oh my gosh, it's a miracle. They're doing great.
Yep. I'll just say, I mean, I don't have a lot of hope for the medical profession to embrace this until we get those randomized control trials and get it through the entire FDA drug development process. But the good news is that we're setting precedents in certain states of removing physicians as gatekeepers for this plant. So in Illinois, we managed to get a law passed that says that, for instance, the veterans community in Illinois simply sends their medical records to the Department of Health. They don't have to find a doctor to certify them there, and they simply have to prove they have one of the qualifying conditions in their medical chart, and they get a card. And I think that's the right approach. Is if physicians aren't willing or able to learn enough about this plant to be gatekeepers, then they should just be removed, and we should let it should be treated like any other a descheduled nutraceutical.
I will say, though, in my 5 years of being a cancer mom, I have seen extraordinary shifts in ideals around this plant. My daughter's oncologist will literally, if we need to change her, and we've tried cannabis alone, by the way, and nutrition and everything else. My daughter's tumor is just, it's not a high-grade tumor, it's a low-grade, so it's a little trickier. But her oncologist will literally come in and he'll be like, all right, Mom, here are all the different drugs that can interact with this clinical trial. Do any of these mean cannabis? And it's just like the most amazing thing that, you know, they're starting to wrap their arms around this. When my kid was inpatient for her brain surgery, she didn't have one single bruise. They cut her from here to here. She didn't have one single bruise on her entire face, no signs of visible swelling. She was released from the hospital in less than 48 hours when it should have been 3 to 5 days, and was told she could go back to school in 1 to 2 days, which should have been 1 to 2 weeks, all of which are medically impossible. So we keep, these patients keep showing up in these inpatient rooms, and these nurses and these doctors are witnessing these shifts in these kids, and they're seeing that they're becoming these miraculous healers. I mean, you could set the clock to when we finally were able to get food on Sophie's stomach and get cannabis inside of her, and what it did to her pain, and her as just a human being. I had to go grab the nurse and show her, and it was so profound. She then passed that information on to the next nurse so that information could be shared. And I am now taken room to room to room every time we're inpatient to meet with other families on that hospital by the nurses on that floor. So the shift is happening. It's really our federal government that just needs to get the hell out of our way, because there are a lot of doctors out there. I think the poll, thank you.
Exactly.
They did a poll, I believe it was last year, where it was over 90% of doctors and nurses believed in research for pediatric cancer patients, and it's our government right now.
Yeah, and the physician community, I mean, a poll on MedPage showed over 60% of physicians believe privately in an anonymous survey that cannabis should be fully legalized and prohibition should be ended around cannabis. But like you said, so privately, physicians will tell you they believe this is medicine, they understand it's helping, but their hands are tied. They're afraid they're going to jeopardize both their medical license and their DEA registrant status by participating in that. So
they cannot administer it in the hospitals. They cannot guide it. Nurses are doing it, but doctors can't for risk of losing their medical license. But they are, and look, there's still doctors out there that will threaten to call CPS if you try to put your kid on cannabis. But that shift has changed exponentially in the last 5 years, and I've watched it with my own eyes. So we're going in the right direction. We just can't get there fast enough, in my opinion, because people are dying that don't need to.
Thank you.
Thank you. To conclude, what I'd like to do is just go down the line, and each of you, please, introduce yourself from the point of view of the organization you're working with. And if there's a call to action to our audience, do it. And everybody take, about 90 seconds. Tracy.
Are we starting with me? So for me, I have all the pieces to my puzzle. I've got the researcher, I've got the university, I've actually got multiple researchers. We have 47 in Israel. We have another 20 here in Los Angeles at a top university here, of which name I'm not supposed to mention because they're too worried about losing their federal grants. I've got everything that I need to make a successful trial, something that could be absolutely groundbreaking, not just for cancer because we're looking at the immune system, but for every person on the face of the planet that has something going on with their immune system, whether it's, it's psoriasis or whether it's, autism or what have you. We have an approach right now that we believe is going to prove that every person on the face of this planet should be consuming cannabis every day of their lives because of what we are seeing it do to the NK cell system and the immune system. The only thing we need is money, and we need a lot of it, and we need that support from the community, whether it's a philanthropic donation to my 501c3, which is a tax-deductible donation, or whether you want to get in the game with us and you want a piece of equity. That is what we are solely focused on right now, is bringing in strategic partners that believe in this plant, that believe in our mission, and that want to help us save the world.
Thank you. It's great.
Yeah, I want to echo that because I think if you guys aren't aware that your taxpayer dollars, the federal government funding to look at cannabis as a medicine just is not there. So 95% of the federal dollars that go to research cannabis are all safety studies looking at harmful side effects of cannabis and addiction potential of cannabis. So when you look at the scientific literature, the most of the efficacy studies you see, which are very few, are all funded generally by state legislative appropriations, like in California and Colorado, where they had surplus money from their cannabis programs and invested that in efficacy trials. So the most important thing you can do as citizens is demand that your government rebalance the way funding is provided to cannabis research and demand efficacy studies. We've had, over 5 decades, our government has invested billions of dollars into studying harms of cannabis. Now we need to rebalance this money to look at cannabis as a medicine and not just as a drug of abuse.
Well said. It's great.
So we have an election coming up in November. Why don't you could look up who the senators are or other politicians you can vote for and see where they stand on cannabis. A really excellent resource for that is Marijuana Moment. I've been covering sort of these race profiles, looking at the Democratic and Republican candidates for a lot of the federal races and looking at where they stand on cannabis and how they're going to vote on cannabis legislation. Another call to action is, I'm a journalist. There are other journalists here. If you have a story about cannabis, if you have a really interesting, groundbreaking thing that you're researching or so forth. I've interviewed 3 people on this panel. You'll be next. So yeah, please let us tell your stories, because that's how we can change public opinion and change the legislation and so forth.
Go vote.
And vote.
Vote. Yeah, as they say in Chicago, vote early, vote often.
Yes, yes.
Defeat Pete Sessions, okay? He's running for the House. He's the head of the House Rules Committee, and he's the guy who stopped every single cannabis bill in the House for years and years and years. And he's in a tough race right now. So donate to his opponent, like millions. So right now I'm working with Dr. Andrew Weil, Donald Abrams, who's a physician from San Francisco, and former Lieutenant General James Peake, who used to be the Secretary of the Veterans Administration, on kind of just coming up with a simple, rational plan that we can take to state governments so that they kind of understand this. And that goes farther, because it means you're dealing with medical boards, you're dealing with pharmacy boards, and so we're just trying to figure it out. And so I don't really have my hand out here, except that one thing that I love doing, and I'm always up for, is training teams about the details of how this works and how it's going to work, and kind of looking out 2 or 3 years and trying to build organizations that really understand the plant so that they can really service their customers. And it's really rare. I mean, you go into most dispensaries and they're clueless. I mean, they're well-intentioned, but they really don't know much about their products, okay? I mean, the way I describe it is, if you walk into a pharmacy and the pharmacist handed you a vial and said, that could be aspirin, that could be Valium, try it. You have the level of expertise that most dispensaries have.
Experimented on you. That's great. And get this book. This book is awesome. It's incredible. His book. Evan. Oh, where do you get the book? Where do you get the book, Michael?
Any online bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
It's readable. It's gorgeous, and it has incredible information about every single strain you've ever heard of, and a lot you haven't.
And most of it's true.
Evan, please.
So from the athlete's perspective, as founder of Athletes for Care, if you are an athlete who played at any level and you want more information about how you can get involved in the cannabis space, how you can get more information on how it can help you in your life, or you know someone, there's a lot of guys out there, a lot of men and women who are really struggling, trying to find themselves, trying to figure out what to do with all the pills they have, etc. Head to our website, athletesforcare.org. Also there you'll find information about some research initiatives we've got going on, trying to get a research study funded on cannabinoids and brain trauma, as well as cannabinoids as an alternative to opiates. you can donate there as well. So thank you guys very much for the time. Thank you, Digital Hollywood and Victor, for the invite. I appreciate it very much.
And please come back at 2 o'clock. There'll be another session in this room. I want to point out that the normal newsletter has a November guide, the Voters Guide for Marijuana Reform Candidates. I want to thank Tracy and Sue, Madison, Michael, Evan. Awesome panel, right?
Come get the newsletter up here in front, folks. It tells you who to vote for when you're interested in changing the complexion of this very sad situation. Please get it out there and get it done, because voting is the way it's going to change. Thank you. And thank you, Digital Hollywood, for a beautiful event. And thank you for including Normal.
Tell them the next session's in 15 minutes.
The next session is in 15 minutes, so take a break. And go out and have a toke. Got to keep your THC levels up. It's very important at all times.